Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's the Ukraine War Frontline update for the 14th of September 2023. Let's go straight to the front line and up to the northeast axis from Kupyansk-Svatove to Crimea. And there is quite a bit of activity going on here, but it's a lot of the, repelled here, repelled there. There are a few things to take from the Institute for the Study of War, the American military think tank, their daily report. The Wall Street Journal, they say, reported that the Russian military deployed 50,000 troops to retake Kupyansk, but has had little success. I don't know if there will be 50,000 troops involved in what they've been doing recently, because they've not achieved an awful lot, and you'd think they'd achieve a lot more with 50,000 troops. A Ukrainian Kharkiv Oblast head has reportedly stated that Russian forces have not captured a single new village in the Kupyansk direction since 2022, but have only expanded the contested grey zone around a number of settlements. And then, referring to the area near Sinkivka and Petropavlivka, Ukrainian forces are counterattacking from the settlement's flanks in order to avoid Russian encirclement. Okay, let's try and work some of that information out. So this is the idea that certainly in the Kupyansk direction, maybe not going so far south as Svatove down here, but in this direction, the Russians have not taken a single new settlement this year. There was talk about Avdiivka, which is up here, but that's literally like two houses in a forest. So in any real sense, the claim is they haven't taken any new ground. Well, Surat Maps is saying that the Russians have taken some ground to the west of Liman-Pershi, that is north of or northeast of Kupyansk itself, and quite a large piece of territory taken there. If you can see where Andrew Perpetua still has his Russian defensive lines, which reminds me, if you don't know what my map means, if you don't know what the lines signify on my map, please pause the screen and check out the legend. So, Surat Maps says that the situation around Sinkivka hasn't changed too much. There are some corrections that have been made following some video footage and geolocations, that the Russian army's made some advances in the forest to the west of Liman-Pershi, right? As you can see, that's there, but quite a large area of land taken back from here. I have signified this as a rejig. Surat Maps had the Russians all the way down here. And what I said at the time, as people like Andrew Perpetua are saying, that really hasn't been much change around here. The Russian MOD were making big claims. I think Surat Maps just went along with it. And eventually, objective evidence kind of gets in the way of a good old narrative. And when you get geolocated video footage to suggest that maybe the Russian MOD claims were incorrect, then this is what happens. So it's not like the Ukrainians have taken land back, but it's just that evidence has come out to suggest that the Russians aren't indeed where Surat Maps had thought they would be. And you could say the same. That could be the same for around here. Who knows? I think there are certain areas of the map where Surat Maps ends up being more accurate, and other areas I think there's a tendency in this whole sector for them to go along more unquestioningly with what the Russian MOD have said. Anyway, that is what's going on there. The Ukrainians are apparently, as you heard, attacking around the flanks to stop Sinkivka itself becoming enveloped and encircled. So it could be that there is quite a bit of activity around there to stop that from happening. We have a tiny bit of gain that wasn't really announced that I could see, but it was a change in the map here in the Kislivka area, where the Russians literally just this triangle of land. It's probably just a case of rejigging, seeing where shelling was taking place rather than an attack over the last 24 hours, although it could be. Anyway, all the kind of usual repelled activities going on on this axis, down to the forest, where apparently Akhmat, Kadyrov has said Akhmat are active there. Well, they seem to be active all over the front line without really being particularly effective. But that's just my subjective opinion there. Right, Seversk front line, not seen too much information coming out of there. There is here, just going back I forgot to look at my second source here, which is Global War Monitor, which kind of confirms that movement from Surat Maps that the Russian forces have been shelled 2 kilometers west of Liman-Pershi. So there is at least evidence of that movement. Whether they robustly control this area or whether they were a deep reconnaissance group, I don't know. But he says he's not changed the map, just waiting to see how others interpret it. For example, Andrew Perpetua interprets that as just a big grey area. So he's left that, although it has had some increase in Russian territory by Sinkivka, although I think that sits within where I've already got it anyway. So I think this is, around the Liman-Pershi. I suppose I better go back there rather than go to Bakhmut. So around this Liman-Pershi area, you can see that Andrew Perpetua is very much just on the edge of Liman-Pershi. Suriyat Maps is way beyond it. And here we have Global War Monitor, even kind of less than Andrew Perpetua, but there's a little bit of extra land being taken there, apparently, which would be sort of in that area that's kind of in between Perpetua and Suriyat Maps there. So perhaps a little gain there for the Russians. Anyway, to go back to where I was, which is Bakhmut, we are going to look at Rozdelivka to the north of Bakhmut, coming all the way down here. And there's a pin, as you can see to signify that the Ukrainians have made some gains, as according to Russian mapper Suriyat Maps. And that is described here. During the last stage, Ukrainian army managed to expand the buffer zone around the town of Rozdelivka by advancing along the railway. The recent bombardment of the Russian army in this area allowed us to modify the map. Andrew Perpetua talks about this and how they're building some kind of wall across the railway line or something, some kind of fortification, the Ukrainians that is. So that is some success for the Ukrainians moving there. I've long wanted the Ukrainians to have some success here because I think it's an important area. If they can get on these high grounds here that overlook Soledar, they'd overlook Bakhmut really. If you look at the height down here, at the bottom right hand corner of the screen, so that is 143 meters, 150 going up to 180 meters there, 180 going up to 190. So this is much higher ground than 91 meters. There's a good 100-meter difference there. So actually, if the Ukrainians can get this high ground, then they'll give them a really good advantage for Soledar and going on to Bakhmut. But they seem to have stayed there unmoving for an awful long time. They did make some great advances, months ago now, just in a few days, and then it kind of stopped. And we really haven't heard much from there since. A couple of advances here and there, but nothing as I was expecting. It all seems to be about the south at the moment. I guess it's about fixing the Russian army in certain places and going for victory where the attrition ratios are, or going for territory where the attrition ratios are in their favour. And apparently the claims are, that the Russians are losing a lot of troops around Klishchivka. It is an expensive defence for them there. The airfield is successful in the offensive south of Bakhmut, says the General Staff, Kovalev. They had partial success in the districts of Klishchivka, Andriivka and Kurdyamivka, inflicting significant losses on the enemy in terms of manpower and equipment. And remember, I showed you a bit of a video of Russian units complaining that they were down to 20 to 35% of their unit power in Klishchivka or Klishchivka areas, complaining of no counter-battery fire, complaining of a lack of comms that's blocked by electronic warfare, one presumes. So it's tough for the Russians around there. Ukrainian troops, quote, push the Russians out of Klishchivka and also have success in the general direction of Andriivka, Bakhmut and Kurdyamivka, as according to the General Staff, another source there. And yet again, a claim here from the Ukrainians that there is noticeable progress, but it is still too early to say whether we have completely finished the operation there. The hostilities continue. This is Klishchivka, said the speaker of the eastern direction, Yevlash. According to him, the defense forces are making progress in the directions, again, Andriivka, Bakhmut and Kurdyamivka. Okay, so success around here. It appears from what Suriyat Maps is saying that there is some success in this northern part of Klishchivka. It looks really like the Russians have been pushed out of Klishchivka completely, at least according to Suriyat Maps here. We have situation north of Bakhmut. Russian army launched a counterattack and improved its position southeast of Klishchivka. On the other hand, troops withdrew to the railway in the northern part of the locality. Moreover, Ukrainian army is facing difficulties to consolidate its positions in the central part of the town, while they're not able to advance in the remaining parts out of its control. A bit of a mixed bag there from Suryat Map, saying that there are some gains for the Ukrainians in this area, for the Russians in this area, but the Russians have been pushed out to the north, but the Ukrainians are struggling to gain robust control over the town as a whole. I mean, there are various things said in the ISW actually concerning Bakhmut, which, a prominent Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces conducted successful counterattacks near Klishchivka and pushed Ukrainian forces out of the settlement, but that heavy Ukrainian artillery fire is preventing Russian forces from re-establishing their positions in central and southern Klishchivka. So there is a claim that the Ukrainians have been completely pushed out of the settlement. I doubt that is true. Most of the other claims seem to be that the Ukrainians are dealing quite a lot of damage to the Russians there, and the Russians are taking some heavy losses. For example, Russian channels report the situation in Klishchivka. As expected, says Null reports, quote, about Klishchivka, Ukrainian forces took almost the entire village. A small part is under our control. The group came out from our side. There are 300, meaning sort of wounded. Russian military correspondent published a first-hand account from Klishchivka and Avdiivka. So I had this reference this morning, but the translation wasn't very good. Anton Gerashchenko, who is the advisor to the Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, has got a better translation. Okay, so he says he has no reason to believe this. So a military correspondent has produced this Russian-sourced quote and says it seems pretty kosher. So the quote is, Igor, hi, I'd like to tell you about Klishchivka and Avdiivka. I was evacuated from there yesterday. I'd like to tell you about our command. The tank's been kicking us out for 24 hours. Yesterday at about 3 a.m. it got mad that we were holding on until the end and started to demolish the hut. I was concussed as well as two of my fellow soldiers. I don't know how, by some miracle we survived. We were hit with everything from shrapnel ammunition to cluster munitions. We asked for artillery support. We were told there were no shells. And I talked about this morning, about how certainly in certain places on the front line, there's just a lack of Russian ammunition. There's obviously been a project for the Ukrainians to degrade the Russian capabilities, and that includes by starving them, hitting their supply depots, hitting their logistics nodes and routes, so that eventually the Russians are going to struggle with ammunition and equipment. How were we supposed to hold it? The tank spent 3 ammunitions on us for 3 men, and ours supposedly ran out of shells. So as I said earlier, the Ukrainians are happy to use 3 tank shells to take out 3 people, and the Russians don't have any ammunition at all to send back. So he says, we are effing crazy about that, SH-1T. And now they're throwing sticks at special forces. We stayed until the end. Akhmat left the day before yesterday. There's 800 refuseniks and deserters in the forest belt. The 42nd Division left yesterday. We stayed with 3 squads until the end, until the advance started. We lost 2 of our guys on the way out. That is some incredible information if true. 800 refuseniks and deserters in the forest belt. Now, what the forest belt is, where it is, I don't know. There's different forest belts around the whole area, and so yeah, I'm not sure where he's meaning. But man, that's a lot of people who are not fighting and who have basically deserted as well. If that's true, that is a real challenge for the Russians. So I think the Ukrainians are basically in having the momentum here. I think the Russians have got a really difficult job. I think Avdiivka is functionally Ukrainian. I think Kupyansk-Svatove is going to be under a lot of pressure going forward, especially if the Russians are no longer able to defend any of Klishchivka at all. Again, I've questioned previously, why bother being there in any way, shape or form? It seems to be an absolute waste of human life for the Russians to send defensive forces to Klishchivka. I don't think it gains them anything. Right, so we're now going to come down from Bakhmut to Avdiivka. And actually, I don't have any granular information, just some rather general stuff. There were some announcements from Hanamalia yesterday that got people a little bit worried, saying that actually another area of concern for Ukraine is developing on a front line. The Ukraine Deputy Defense Minister Hanamalia said that the situation has worsened in both Marinka and Avdiivka. Russia has again tried to storm Ukrainian positions. Deep State map shows it remains precarious, says Tim White. The Deep State map indicates that to the north of Avdiivka, northeast, there are Russian attacks, and in Marinka, both from south and north of the road going through Marinka, there are Russian attacks. So I don't know what to make of the claims about Avdiivka. There's just not enough information, and I can't find too much. But essentially, the claim is that the Russians are attacking up here, possibly. We know that Ukraine has had some joy, although it might have been a little bit oversold in Opitny while the Russians were attacking up here. I don't know if anything's particularly changed, whether the Russians sort of pulled people from there to help down in Opitny or just continued attacking. But it seems like the Russians are causing some problems for the Ukrainians there and in Marinka, both sides, north and south of the road. By the looks of the Deep State map, you could have the Russians trying to put pressure on Pobyeda, which is held out, although Syriac Maps has Pobyeda partially under control of the Russians and has had that for a long time. Andrew Perpetua has not agreed with that for months, so I'm not sure exactly where the Russians are around here. I would be more cautious to say they're probably back here, or at least back there. So that is the situation in those places. Not really enough information coming out of there. We come to the southern Donetsk front. We have not a great deal of information coming out of here. It appears that the Russians are still under quite a bit of pressure in Novomayorsk. Andrew Perpetua yesterday or the other day mentioned how he thinks that this was a kind of failed or repelled Ukrainian attack. They got so far and then kind of left it at that. But there is video evidence that the Russians are struggling there. This is Novomayorsk, I believe. Moscow boys are anxious. So what sort of things do they say? Okay, so they're in Novomayorsk. The enemy constantly works with us with cassette ammunition, gunpowder, as well as mortars. They constantly make rounds in a number of 5 to 20 people. In principle, the task is feasible for everyone. We hold on. It's hard, but we hold on. Work, brothers. We are standing. Your emotions, we are standing. Would you ride in this with me on a P-Nerd Yak 67? I don't know what he's really talking about there. He goes out and fires a sort of RPG, and then they go off. They seem to be walking around. I'd like to geolocate this, but they seem to be walking around Novomayorsk. I don't know what part of it is, complaining that there's no water, to be continued. So, yeah, they're still... I don't know the timestamp of that, other than it's come out in the last 24 hours. But the Russians still seem to be in Novomayorsk and operating without too much issue, walking around there, but claiming that there are just these rounds of Ukrainian troops, 5 to 20 troops, which is exactly what I said, just small kind of platoons of forces going from house to house in the north. It's not some big attack, and so therefore it's really would be quite simple to repel those attacks, and I don't think that's too much of an issue for the Ukrainians. They're just prodding and probing to see where they can find a weakness. I was expecting one to maybe be to the south of Novodonetsk, but not heard anything about that recently either. All quiet around Zaporizhzhia. I say all quiet. They're still hitting all of these places with mortars and artillery and whatnot, and they're FPV drones. So they're drone footage, I think, from Zaporizhzhia. Now, in the Pryutny area, just north of there's some gains, as according to Andrew Perpetua, a slight bit of gains up here. Or no, actually, it wasn't Andrew. That's the wrong color. It was Syriac Maps that's readjusted some of their mapping in that area. So actually, just they didn't really announce it as far as I can work out, but it is a change to their mapping to show that Ukraine has made some gains there. Then we come to the west to kind of the main area of fighting in the Robotyne sector, where not a huge amount of change to the mapping. Here we have some gains, as according to Andrew Perpetua, for the Ukrainians, literally just like a field's worth of gains there. So it's not an awful lot, but it is quite important because that's the... in fact, I'm going to bring up his map. That is the area of trenches that the Russians were still clinging on to, as according to some sources. Some were saying that the Ukrainians had taken full control of it. Let's see the fortifications, and I'll give you a sense of what's going on. So we're talking about Robotyne here. And this is exactly the field. He's now got it as a grey zone, but this was the trench line that the Russians might still have been holding on to, that had two antennae coming up there. There are actually two bits of trench line going forward from there. The Ukrainians, I think, had control of all of these bits broadly, but they may have been struggling with this area. Anyway, it looks like they've cleared the Russians out. Don't know that means that the Ukrainians are there in any robust manner, because, well, the Russians are bombing them, and I wouldn't like to be hanging out in those trenches under TOS thermobaric munition bombardments. But nonetheless, yeah, that's what's happened there. Not too much detail about the rest of this area. We have that's exactly the claims we've just been dealing with. Global War Monitor saying Ukraine has continued its advance 500 to 600 meters now from the first houses of Novoprokopivka, and there are some geolocations of Ukrainian forces just to the west of Verbove here. So we go back to Verbove, we geolocate some of these. I did one of these this morning, and they were well within the sort of, well, actually, according to Surrey maps, that would be in the grey zone, but it could well be in the control zone for Andrew Perpetua's mapping. Let's see how close to Verbove. Yeah, so that's probably just somewhere around there for the geolocation. And then let's look at the third one while we can, see if that gives us any different conclusions. And oops, what am I like? Completely wrong place. There we go. And yeah, so much of a muchness in that area. The Ukrainians are, some might say, that's making advances in the grey zone, moving closer to Verbove. There's obviously difficult terrain around here. Not only the larger tank ditch and manned trench here, but also probably other obstacles in between. I just haven't heard much detail about how well the Ukrainians have done in moving down and along this trench here. I mean, Andrew Perpetua has the Russians doing drone strikes on the trenches, so there's obviously Ukrainian presence there still in the last 24 hours. But it's obviously just difficult work to move further on. Right, just going back to the ISW, that says not an awful lot about this area, other than geolocated footage published on September the 12th shows that Ukrainian forces made limited gains south of Robotyne, and that would be where we're talking about here. So there is shelling of TOS shelling, and that's probably what Andrew Perpetua has over here. So TOS shelling of that, what I call the alien's head bit of trench work there. So we'll just put that in my map just to make sure. And this is the ISW, yeah, talking about that geolocation there. Yeah, exactly there. So that would indicate that, yeah, indeed the Ukrainians have made some advances there. So then going west to Piatychatki and towards Luhove, there's nothing really to report, unfortunately. No news coming out of there, that area. So we're going to move to the Dnipro River, see what the ISW has to say. Actually, before we get there, I think this is important. Ukrainian Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov reported on September 13th that Russian forces are strengthening defensive positions in occupied Zaporizhzhia. Fedorov stated that Russian forces are setting up new unspecified equipment and Dragon's Teeth anti-tank fortifications near Tokmak, and digging new trenches and strengthening defensive structures near the front line in Polyivsky Rayon. That is a challenge. So, when you have really tough frontline exchanges and fighting going on here, the Russians are able, as long as they can keep the Ukrainians in position, they're able to build further defensive fortifications, either just behind where they're being attacked. So Polohi is one, but also, back in Tokmak, which is already very heavily fortified. So that project for the Russians continues. Right. Okay. Back to now Kherson, where the ISW says a Russian source claimed on yesterday that Ukrainian forces continue operations on islands in the Dnipro River Delta. A Russian mill blogger claimed that battles for unspecified islands in the Delta are ongoing and that Ukrainian forces have entrenched themselves on some unspecified islands and maintain positions near the Antonovsky Bridge on the left bank of the river. Footage published yesterday purportedly shows artillery elements of the 205th Motorized Rifle Brigade striking Ukrainian forces near Kherson city. So that continues. A lot of, some artillery still continues hitting Kherson city. I do wonder whether some of the Russian artillery has been degraded in this area, as we see quite a lot of footage of self-propelled howitzers being taken out, so on and so forth. In Kherson, I have just this claim. It says the armed forces are pushing back the Russians, clearing a strip of 5 to 15 kilometers from the left bank of the Dnipro, says Natalia Humanyuk, spokesperson of the Southern Defense Forces. According to the spokeswoman, this will make it possible to critically reduce the number of shelling on the right bank of the Kherson region. Well, absolutely, but that's a pretty big claim there, that they are pushing the Russians back 5 to 15 kilometers from the riverbank. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I mean, they're getting some footholds in certain areas, but clearing a strip of 5 to 15 kilometers from the left bank is probably overselling the Ukrainian successes there. I mean, yes, they are in the process of trying to do that. That's probably true, but I don't think they're anywhere near achieving that yet. But I guess we'll wait and see. Anyway, that's a Frontline update. Not an awful lot of info, but just thought I'd give you all the detail I could. Thank you very much. Take care. Speak to you possibly later. I've got a bit of a busy day. I'll try and get an extra out, but if I don't, I'll speak to you tomorrow, of course. Thank you very much for your support. Take care. Speak soon.